Good afternoon and welcome to today's featured webinar. My name is Rick Vanover with Veeam Software and I'm going to host this event. Greg Shields, Microsoft MVP, is our speaker today. Good afternoon, Greg. How are you?
Oh, pretty good.
All right. We have a great topic here today from a thought leader in the subject. What we're going to be talking about is best practices for virtualizing domain controllers. And this may be a little bit of a deceiving title because as you registered it would have said 6. But I guess we have a 2-for-1 today because the total is 12. Before we get started, I want to give a couple administrative points about today's webinar. First of all, each registrant will be given a follow-up email in a couple of days with a link to download these PowerPoint slides as well as replay this webinar. Further, if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to go ahead and use the Q&A panel for the GoToWebinar widget that you're watching this webinar from. I will do my best to answer those questions as they come up during the webinar. If it makes sense, I will hold on to them for Greg and we can discuss them together at the end of the webinar. I encourage you to pay attention to Greg's material because at the end of the webinar I'm going to throw out a question based on Greg's material, and the first 10 correct respondents to that question will win their choice of popular books. The next thing I want to do before we get started is give a quick overview of Veeam Software. Veeam Software develops innovative products for virtualization, infrastructure management, and data protection. And our goal is to reduce costs, mitigate risk, and fully realize the promise of virtualization with Veeam. We had a very successful 2010. Some of the awards are shown down there below. And we have high-level relationships with both VMware and Microsoft. So that is relevant to today's material with Active Directory domain controllers. With that, I will turn it over to Greg. Take it away.
Thanks, Rick. And one question for you, Rick. If I answer my own question correctly, do I get the book?
Maybe I'll give you a speaker comp copy of the book.
All right. Well, thank you. And thanks also to all of you for taking some time out of the middle of your day-to-day to talk with really both Rick and I about domain controllers. As Rick said, we want to apologize because as I was putting together the slide deck for this presentation, I thought, you know, 6 best practices just aren't enough. We just need to have more best practices. So I figured, why not give all of you a little bit of extra assistance in helping you understand what's a good thing or what are good practices whenever you're virtualizing your Active Directory domain controllers. As Rick said, my name is Greg Shields, and I am an MVP. I'm also a senior partner with Concentrated Technology. That's concentratedtech.com. And I'm looking forward to helping you kind of understand really the big question here, which is, well, should I virtualize my domain controllers? You know, you are here because you are probably either in the process of virtualizing your domain controllers, or maybe you already have, or maybe you are trying to figure out whether or not virtualizing your domain controllers are really a good idea or not. And that question, whether you should or not, is honestly a completely valid question. Now, a little history. You've been doing virtualization for a while, at least some period of time. And you probably remember a period of time not that long ago whenever we spent a lot of time thinking about this whole notion of virtualization candidacy. Right? Is this workload something that we can virtualize? Can we virtualize a SQL server? Can never virtualize Exchange? Never virtualize SQL for some reason, or any sort of server by virtue of its name, perhaps. Now, back in those days, we used to kind of unfairly point at particular workloads, particular types of servers, and say that we couldn't virtualize them. And even domain controllers were one of those servers. And these days, however, the industry, or the prevailing conventional wisdom in the industry, is evolving towards this sort of new reality that every IT workload can be virtualized. Right? Every single thing that you have in your data center, or almost, 99.9% of the things that are in your data center today can be virtualized. And so one of the big concerns is obviously, can I handle the performance? Can my virtual platform handle the performance of what I'm doing? And are there any kind of sticking points associated with making that decision? Well, when it comes to domain controllers, DCs are kind of a special case. They are somewhat different than some of the other workloads that you may have, and in part due to, one, because they're transactional database oriented, and also because of their replication nature. So you can virtualize your domain controllers today, but there are a lot of potential mistakes that could be made. So as you're going about making that decision, well, there are some things that maybe you should consider in terms of your configuration, not only just from the backup configuration here, because this is Veeam that's sponsoring this webinar, but also some of the other configurations for how you would put together that domain controller. Now, an Active Directory domain controller is unlike other IT workloads in a lot of different ways. As I said, we have this multi-master replication. Right? We have lots of different domain controllers that are all more or less loosely synchronized with each other. And so that multi-master replication has to be carefully designed to avoid any kind of errors in transferring that data around. And at DC, its services lean on top of a transactional database that really can't be backed up like regular files and folders. So you can think of Active Directory's database, even though it's not the same database format, but you can think of it like a SQL database or an Oracle database or an Exchange database. It's transactional in nature. So these two things are two pieces that you have to be really conscious about when you're designing your virtualized domain controller infrastructure. The other piece that's really important as well is the fact that your Active Directory infrastructure is sort of the foundation for everything else in your IT environment. Right? You lose Active Directory and poof, you've lost everything. So you have to be particularly careful about the decisions you make with that foundation. Now, on the other side, the domain controllers that you have are really not big resource consumers. They don't really have that much that they have to do in terms of performance. Even in the very largest of environments, I think I put up here an Active Directory database for 1,000 users is probably only 400 megs in size. So the amount of resources that you have to apply to a domain controller is not that big. And a relatively small CPU and memory utilization footprint, at least in comparison with, I don't know, your Exchange server or your line of business SQL server. And for most people, applying it, at least in the physical world, dual processors, a couple gigs of RAM, usually enough hardware to support even the largest domain controller in Active Directory infrastructure. The other kind of cool part about them is the fact that domain controllers, and hopefully all of you have this, tend to come in pairs or more than pairs. Having them in more than pairs or having them multiple instances of them makes them redundant by nature. So generally, if you make a big mistake with one, well, you've got other ones that are out there to be able to kind of pick up the slack. So arguably, domain controllers are in many ways kind of the perfect virtualization candidate because of that low resource requirement, and then also because of all the benefits that you can reap out of them. Now, in doing that, there are kind of 12 different important points, 12 best practices that you should be aware of whenever you're doing this domain controller virtualization. Okay, let's talk about what these are. Number one is just the recognition that domain controllers require high availability, right? And if you're going to implement domain controllers as a virtual machine, the multi-master replication that occurs between those domain controllers kind of assumes that those domain controllers are always up and running. Right? That multi-master replication, it's relatively tolerant of domain controllers going down, but there are some things that are implemented by Microsoft, like disabling write caches and some other features that kind of make it not like it. The replication itself, not like the fact when servers go down. So number one is just simply the recognition that any virtualized domain controller should be hosted inside of a highly available virtual platform or virtual environment. Now, you can get this with clustering, you can get this with HA, you can get this with live migration or what have you, but implementing domain controllers in some sort of virtual platform that supports high availability, very, very important. Now, number two here is this recognition of caution whenever you're going through the snapshotting, pausing, and cloning process. Now, virtualization, as you know, adds a lot of these cool fancy features for VMs. You know this, right? This was one of the things that really attracted you to virtualization in the first place, that snapshots can protect you against the patch that goes awry. And you can pause a machine to stop their processing without actually stopping the VM, or you can clone a machine to copy their contents and copy and paste that virtual machine to somewhere else to create another virtual machine. But you have to be very, very conscious with these. You have to be very judicious with these different tactics, because using any of these against a domain controller is really not recommended. Okay, the pausing of a domain controller can cause some bad things, the cloning of one, and certain types of snapshotting can also do the same thing. Remember that AD's multi-master replication really wasn't designed to handle snapshotting, or the virtual machine snapshotting that you get coming out of your virtual platform, or the disk rollback that you might have from that snapshot. Okay, you could get a situation with database corruption or USN rollback. Both of these are really, really bad situations that can occur with that snapshotting, with the rollback situation. Pausing a domain controller for too long a time could create similar problems. If you ever attempt to clone a domain controller, don't attempt to clone a domain controller, because cloning that DC can cause a situation called replication isolation, which could cause some very unexpected and not very fun results with those users and computers. So never snapshot, never pause, never clone, except. And the important caveat here is that sometimes the term snapshot is, well, it has multiple meanings. Depending on which vendor you may work with, the term snapshot may have a different meaning. And it may be a different process that's being done by that vendor. So the snapshotting that Microsoft recognizes in Hyper-V, or that VMware recognizes in vSphere, may be different than the snapshotting you would get from your data protection solution or your backup solution. So the important caveat here is some data protection solutions will provide full application-aware quiescence during a snapshot, which means never snapshot unless your data protection solution tells you that you can. So very important caution here with number 2. Number 3 also relates to backups, and we'll get to some of the other non-backup things here in just a second, but also recognize the fact that the virtual platform snapshotting, the vSphere snapshotting and the vSphere cloning are activities that one should never attempt against a domain controller, because those terms sometimes have other meanings, and the meanings that you get out of vSphere may be different than the meaning you may get out of Veeam, for example. So if you are considering backing up your Active Directory, which I think we all should, then educate yourself on all of the backup options that are available for those domain controllers. Right, the solution that you're going to select, the one that you want, is the one that's going to gather that necessary data quickly. It's going to use some sort of block-level approach. It's not going to try to pull these files off like the old system state backups, where what you're looking for is almost a near continuous data protection solution. With today's technologies, the whole concept of daily backups and backing things up on a once-a-day sort of arrangement is almost grown quaint with the types of features that are available in these third-party solutions outside of the Windows native tools. Right? The right solution, the solution that you want for your Active Directory, will enable you to restore any object, so a user or computer object, a server, or even your entire forest, back to really any period in time. And if you lose your Active Directory forest, or if somebody accidentally deletes an object, you want the flexibility to be able to back up maybe from yesterday's backup, or even to 15 minutes ago's backup, or an hour and 45 minutes ago backup. This capability, the ability to do this to this level of granularity is all completely capable with the technologies that are available today, not necessarily capable with the technologies you get directly out of Windows. Now, shifting away from backups for just a second, there are some other features or other configurations that you have to be kind of conscious with when it comes to virtualizing domain controllers. Number 4 here is one that, yes, after 11 plus years of Active Directory, we're still talking about time sync. And so when Windows 2000 came out and Active Directory began to be the way of the future, we spent a lot of time talking about clock drift and time sync, because the Kerberos piece of Active Directory doesn't really tolerate domain controllers and the rest of the computers in your domain being out of synchronization. So it hasn't been a problem until once we fixed it back in the year 2000. Well, virtualization has kind of reintroduced this clock drift problem because the hypervisor itself, the way that the hypervisor pays attention to the different virtual machines that are running on top of a virtual host, this time slicing behavior, can actually introduce this clock skew back into the whole environment. So you may have fixed it back in Windows 2000, but it may reintroduce itself if you don't pay proper attention to clock drift inside of your virtual machines. Now that can be handled by the virtual platform's installed tool set, the integration components for Hyper-V, the VMware tools for VMware, or whatever your tool set is. Or it can be handled by synchronizing those clocks to some external time source. Okay, if you have some Stratum 1 time source that's outside on the internet somewhere that you can use to synchronize yourself, do so. And pay attention also to the resolution of that time source. So remember, Kerberos has about a 5-minute buffer that it can handle, but no more than that. If your time synchronization is going to be more than that, well, you need to make sure that you have a good enough resolution so that your clocks are going to stay close enough in synchronization. So pay attention. Sometimes your virtual tool set can actually cause a problem that actually stops the synchronization of those clocks. The VMware tools is one example of that, where the VMware tools can actually stop inside of a virtual machine, and whenever that occurs, well, time stops syncing and you end up creating a problem. Number 5 has to do with the provisioning of resources and really the concern about over-provisioning of resources. And this is kind of a contentious point, but it's one that you should be really aware of because there is an evolving, I guess, conventional wisdom when it comes to how you provision resources in virtual machines. Right, back in the old days, dual cores and 4 gigs of RAM was what a lot of people would just create as their physical server and provision their physical server because it was cheap. It was easy, right? I can just go and check off the box of I need a dual core server and 4 gigs of RAM, and the server would arrive and it would be very easy. However, these days, even with the overcommitment capabilities that we have inside of our hypervisors, the assignment of resources should be done to meet with what resources that VM actually requires. You remember back in the day, right, when we had that kind of hypervisor war going on, VMware versus Hyper-V, Hyper-V versus VMware. Well, one of the big reasons behind that hypervisor war was this whole notion of overcommitment and memory overcommit. Well, we spent a lot of time focusing on overcommitment, and it's a great solution to have, right? You need to have overcommitment for those situations where you might have a failure and you need a bunch of VMs to move on to a single host. But for provisioning the resources to that VM, for how many gigs of RAM you're going to assign to that domain controller, it's recommended that you right size whatever amount that domain controller requires to the amount that you give it. If you're giving it more than that, if you're still giving it 4 gigs of RAM just because you always have, well, you may actually be hurting your performance, or you may actually be hurting some of the decisions that are made by, for example, load balancing solutions in how it may reprovision and move around those virtual machines to do the best load balancing. So number 5 here is to be cautious, and this is not just with the domain controllers, but with all of your virtual machines, not to over-provision those resources and to right-size them for what they need. Number 6 is, back to backups here, is make sure that your backups actually work. And this is something that's, again, not just domain controllers, but it's really with any of your workloads. The problem that I have today, and this is just sort of a personal, I guess, opinion, is we spend so much time talking about this category of software that we call backup solutions, where the real important point about them is the restore. You know, there's one backup solution out there that it spends, I think it has 1,200 pages, is the administrator's guide for how to use this backup solution. But I think only maybe, I don't know, 50 or 100 of those pages actually have to do with the restore process. You know, at the end of the day, it's the restore that's really important, right? If you can't restore your virtual machine or the data, well, the backups do you no good. So make sure that you have good backups. Now, I could tell you that you should every day go and do a test restore on your backups, but you're not going to do that. We don't do that today. The right solution, and you get that these days with some of the newer technologies and backups, the right solution will automatically verify the integrity of the data for you so that when you take a backup, you'll have that warm fuzzy that you're getting a good backup, one that's going to restore, one that's going to have a guarantee that those Active Directory objects and servers are going to restore correctly. So look for one that provides that data integration or data integrity verification because you don't want to, with the old classic situation, find out that the backups haven't actually been working. Number 7 here talks about anti-affinity. And this term affinity is sort of hypervisor, it's intended to be hypervisor agnostic. Really what I mean by anti-affinity rules is when I have load balancing set up across a number of different hosts, and I've got virtual machines that are moving around so that they're being load balanced, that is a very dynamic process. The virtual machines are always moving around to make sure they have the most appropriate balance of resources and resource commitments across all the hosts that make up your cluster. Hyper-V does this, VMware does this. However, this constant moving around introduces the possibility that 2 domain controllers, or your only 2 domain controllers in the worst possible situation, could end up on the same host. Right? And if those 2 domain controllers end up on the same host and that host fails, well, you've lost your Active Directory. So go into your platform, go into your virtual platform, and set up an anti-affinity rule. This is, it can be done in both VMware, it can be done in Hyper-V. It's a little easier to do inside of vSphere. But set up an anti-affinity rule to ensure that your domain controllers are never going to end up on the same host so that you simply prevent the situation where the loss of a single host is going to mean an Active Directory outage. Number 8, when you are configuring your virtual hosts, it's also important, and there are not a lot of people that actually do this, it's also important to make sure that you separate out the network traffic that is intended for your users from the network traffic that's intended for you, the administrator. So there is this management connection, right, that you have that is used, there's an IP address associated with that connection that you use to connect your vSphere client or your Hyper-V client or whatever into your virtual platform. And so through that management connection is where you might hit that red VCR button to power off a computer, a virtual machine. Now, you don't leave your data center unlocked, do you? If you do, it's probably not a good idea, and maybe we should have another conversation after this webinar. But if you lock your data center, but you're passing your administration, your management traffic over the same network as your client traffic, it's the same thing as unlocking the data center because that red VCR button that you access through the vCenter client is now exposed and available for someone who might find a password to be able to access. So it's a smart idea to separate out that client network traffic from the administration traffic, from the management traffic, in order to protect or add another layer of protection so that your users can't access the red VCR button. Separate them out, put them on a different subnet, route that subnet specifically to your little area in your, your business where your computers are, and make sure that you and your computers are the only ones that can access through that network connection. A big priority with Active Directory, obviously, is keeping it running. But occasionally, somebody makes a mistake. Right? The Active Directory management model, in some cases, unless you're really good about locking it down, almost gives too much power to the individuals in the IT organization that kind of have the least experience. Right? Who do you give Active Directory's big management responsibilities to? Right? Who's creating accounts? Who's adjusting accounts? Probably your help desk people, right? And your help desk people, not always, but tend to be the people that are kind of beginning their IT careers. They're maybe a little bit more on the introductory or the foundational level with their experience. So I have suddenly this immense power to create and delete accounts that I've given to the people with the least experience. So because of that, and it's just a necessary faction, a necessary part of the operations of IT because it's very manual activity. Because I have to give them this power, I want to also put into place this ability to handle those individual object restores in case they make a mistake. Now, in Server 2008 R2, we have the Active Directory recycle bin, which you've probably heard about. You might have spent some time with. It is there. It can be very challenging to use. And again, particularly if you are distributing the ability to make these accidental deletions to the people with the least experience, do you want them to have to type out a 3-line long PowerShell command in order to restore the object that they accidentally deleted? You probably don't want that. So the ability to quickly restore an accidentally deleted object or an entire organizational unit is very important. You want to reduce the time and effort involved with doing that so you can get people back online quickly. Graphical user interfaces, help protect you against this. And even the loss of a domain controller, right? You want to be able to protect yourself against the loss of a domain controller, or heaven help you, corruption of the Active Directory database that requires a forest restore. You want all of this to be relatively trivial, because when the bad stuff happens, right, when Active Directory gets corrupted and the entire company is down, you don't want to have to be responsible for going to find a bunch of PowerShell commands that you need to construct together correctly in order to get everybody back up and running again. You, at least I would, want to be able to click a button and know that it's going to happen automatically. Number 10 has to do with storage performance. Although domain controllers, again, tend not to be very high resource consumers, you still have to be aware of what their performance is. Most people today, and I spend so much time with many of my clients who are working in virtual environments, and many of them today, still today, do not have any kind of performance management activities that they're doing, let alone tools that assist with those activities. If you are virtualizing today, performance management and capacity management are the two most important activities in virtualization, and so few of us do them. Now, in the old days, we used to think that, well, processing power and lack of memory were two of the biggest bottlenecks associated with performance management. Today, we have a better realization that while those can be problematic, one of the biggest issues these days actually has to do with storage performance and input-output operations per second. So being aware of your storage performance and being aware that maybe you have some bad connections that are incorrectly configured or oversubscribed, or you have SAN disks that are overtasked, or spindle contention that are slowing down your effective performance, you need to be aware of what these are. And so even though domain controllers may not have storage performance requirements that are heavy, monitoring for those IOPS and monitoring performance in general is still, I say here, an important activity, but I will argue is the most important activity in your virtual environment today. So find yourself a performance management tool. It's very, very important. It can also be important as well to potentially remain just a little bit physical. And this is yet another kind of contentious, I guess, best practice here, because you ask 10 different IT pros and they'll give you 10 different answers here as far as whether you should keep a domain controller physical or not. I don't know, right? If you're making the move to virtualization, you're probably going to have at least some old physical computers laying around. And even with virtualization's seemingly magical capabilities, the entirety of your virtual environment could be this big single point of failure. Somebody writes a hypervisor vulnerability or a hypervisor attack. Your storage has an interruption. Your SAN has a problem. You suddenly get resource overutilized, or somebody misconfigures something and the whole thing just falls flat. So again, maybe this is just maybe this is just me being extra careful here, but preserving at least one domain controller as physical at least will ensure that your Active Directory remains working during the worst of your virtual environment outages. And I say this because the restoration of a virtual environment can be made a little more challenging or a little more complex if directory services are not available. So you might just think about leaving one as physical, and again, this might just be superstition on my part, but doing so will ensure that Active Directory remains even as you have big problems with your virtual environment. Hopefully you won't. Then lastly here, number 12, is, I guess, a pet peeve of mine. And although we are getting better when it comes to disaster recovery, we as an industry are getting better. There was a period of time when everybody knew that disaster recovery existed. We're familiar that disaster recovery is a solution that no one really does. And then there was a period of time where all of us were working on having a plan. So these days, I think all of us kind of have this plan for what to do in the case of a disaster. I don't know, maybe your plan is that you're going to go and grab all the servers one at a time and get them out of the data center and drive them somewhere, but at least it's a plan. Well, virtualization makes disaster recovery so much more accessible, even in small environments, because I now have this nice, virtual disk file that I can replicate somewhere else, and it's almost trivial in order to invoke a disaster recovery plan. So having a plan is almost no longer good enough, and having that full solution for Active Directory is really what you need to have. You also need to have a set of supporting tools. Right? These solutions, these things that you install to back up the Active Directory data, and then ultimately allow you to restore that Active Directory data across all of the different possible disasters that could occur. A disaster may not necessarily be the classic disaster of the tornado that causes the tidal wave, that causes the hurricane, that causes the nuclear bomb to hit your data center. Hopefully not all four of those things happen at the same time. A disaster can also be you lose an organizational unit, your computer's OU. It's a pretty big disaster. And arguably, somebody right-clicking and accidentally hitting delete on that computer's OU is probably more likely than all four of those big major disasters with a capital D happening all at once. So the solution that you want is going to be able to restore your domain controllers and or their objects in seconds or minutes and not in days, because you want to get them up and running fast. You want to be able to get them ready to service the users. Right? A good solution may also be able to restore your Active Directory and its services, and then in the background complete the restore while it actually gets the users up and running. These are new technologies that are available now. So plan on having a solution that fits your needs for getting yourselves back online really fast. So as Rick said, I did sort of give you 12 best practices. I thought 6 just weren't enough, so here are 6 more for virtualizing your domain controllers. Should you virtualize your DCs? Probably so. They are pretty good, pretty easy, low-hanging fruit for moving to virtualization and as virtualization candidates. And as you do so, consider these 12 best practices to get you going. Thank you very much. And Rick?
Well, thank you, Greg. That was great stuff, and we had quite an active discussion, series of discussions in the Q&A panel. I'm going to bring up a few of them here. On point 11, there was a question or a point raised by Joe T, who said, what about maybe throwing one domain controller with local storage in as kind of interim affinity related to keeping one physical, meaning accounting for a SAN failure. That's an option. Of course, every requirement and environment is different. That's a good idea. If you put it on local storage, you're really protected from a catastrophic SAN failure. Another person had said using free ESXi. He didn't mention which storage, but again, if the vSphere stack is the issue, you're outside of the vCenter realm, and you might have a standalone ESXi host that could serve that purpose as well, to kind of really separate from a catastrophic vSphere issue. A couple of people have asked that will the slides be available for download and the webinar available for replay? And the answer is yes. You'll get an email in a few days with links to both of those tasks. Manish asked a good question, and I gave him a very long answer because he was the first one, and I had the opportunity to give him that long answer. But the question was, can you P to V a domain controller? And Greg, I'm going to give my answer, and then I'm curious, I want to hear yours. Mm-hmm. My answer is no asterisks. And when I say no, I mean it's always cleaner to promote and demote through a new build of a domain controller. The asterisk would be if you have to, meaning maybe you're not capable of doing the promote demote. The only P to V that I would ever consider would be the cold clone type of zero transactional state, boot the domain controller up from the PXE environment, Windows PE environment, and do the conversion that way. And that's kind of with like a frown face. You know, if I had to give you a grade in school, that would be a D. Greg, what's your thought on P2V in a domain controller?
There are no technical reasons why you couldn't P2V a domain controller. There's nothing like in the rules, as it were, that say that you can't. Now, and I guess you made the caveat also, is that, you know, doing it with the machine powered off is a smart idea, and you're exactly right. Only because of the oops potential there in terms of accidentally having two of the exact same domain controllers turned on at the same time, which can invoke that replication isolation. Very, very nasty situation if you have that invoked. You just want to avoid that in every case. But I think what's more important, it's exactly what you had said, Rick, but I think you focused just slightly on something different. I think what's more important is that you could P2V a DC, but why? Right? Active Directory replication, it kind of just does that work for you. And so you absolutely can, but you know, from the perspective of starting off with a clean slate, I would create a new domain controller, create a new Windows OS instance, and then install the domain controller pieces and allow replication to replicate all that data over to the new DC in a virtual machine, and you're good to go. So you can, but why?
One question kind of came up from Matt, Matt H., especially if there's only one domain controller, and I changed this question a little bit and said, what if you're using something like Small Business Server, you know, kind of the all-in-one deal. I think you might be a little bit better off doing the P2V that way, but I definitely you know, do the zero transactional state. And actually, I don't know if Small Business Server, like the mainline series of 2008, can allow you to stop domain services. I'm not sure.
I will have to, so there is one caution there, and this is particularly with SBS. And so P2V has there's one situation where P2V sometimes fails, and that is when you have, this is more so in the 2003 days and earlier, not so much in 2008, but if you have a copy of the operating system that is locked, is OEM locked to the piece of hardware that you have, and you try to P2V it off, you'll end up with a blue screen whenever you power up that VM. So if you have one of them OEM special licensing situations with your SBS server, that can inhibit you from doing P2V.
Oh, that's a general statement across all OSs and not necessarily SBS. It's definitely a good thing to remember.
Yeah, it just happens to, they just tend to sell SBS in that way a lot, more so than the other ones.
True, true. Nathan H. asks another good question. Any considerations, advice, warnings about using vSphere's FT virtual machine capability for a domain controller?
I don't know the exact requirements as far as FT is concerned, so I can't repeat to you the exact what works and what doesn't, and part of that's because that list is very long. So you know what the gotchas are and what the correct configurations are with FT is really, really, really long. Now
the big one is single CPU. That's the big one.
Yeah. So opinion is, at least this is a total opinion here, that FT is probably not something you're going to want to do in a domain controller situation, because FT and just simply having another DC they kind of solve the same thing. And I would want the technology that's designed to protect me against a failure, an AD failure, which is AD replication, to be responsible for bringing me back online than some sort of FT. Again, that list of requirements and gotchas is still, with this version, still relatively long. So I would consider maybe just adding another domain controller than trying to use something like FT.
I agree, and a lot of people on the Q&A panel say, "Don't use FT," and I'll be honest with you, I don't. But it was a question that was asked, and
it is a feature that is available.
Right. Aman asks a good one about an RDM for the virtual machine. My personal answer on RDMs is use them only when required, and I would not say a domain controller requires RDMs. So Greg, your thought on RDMs for domain controllers?
Yeah, so RDMs have a backups impact, right? We use RDMs for, well, we use RDMs when we don't want to encapsulate the data that a server is using into a VMDK file. Okay, so think about it. If I've got a terabyte-sized or multi-terabyte-sized SQL database, do I really want to have to wrap that thing into a VMDK file? Probably not. So an RDM is nice because it allows me to work with that in a raw format and unplug it and plug it in somewhere else if need be. Now, with a domain controller, I think I mentioned that 1,000 users is, you're talking 400 megs for the size of the database. So you're kind of just throwing, so again, it's a feature that exists, but you're throwing an additional configuration in where you almost don't really need it because, again, domain controllers are not heavy resource use. The database sizes are relatively small, even in very large environments. So they're there and you can use them. There is a backup impact in how the backups will work, but yeah, you don't almost really need to use them in this case for most situations.
I agree with you, and again, you know, working for Veeam, I'll throw out there that life is easier for us with VMDKs, and just a cheap plug for something that came out just this week. On the Veeam blog, I just put up a post about RDMs in regards to using Veeam backup and replications. Definitely check that out. Jim M. asks, if you have a physical DC, are there any of the 5 flexible server master operations, aka FSMA roles, that are better kept on a physical DC rather than putting them on a virtual DC?
I will go out on a limb and say it almost doesn't really matter. And again, that DC is the physical DC. And number 11, I think I stated in there, is almost superstition on my part. Right?
Sure.
So I'm throwing it out there because I'm just like you guys, just don't want to ever get in a situation where I have an AD loss, and I don't want my virtual platform loss to impact my AD. So that physical box in sort of my imaginary world is there just in case something goes down. Now, obviously, you might move those FSMA roles onto or not onto that box in order to prepare for that eventuality or to, you know, be there in case that eventuality happens. But for the most part, you know, you are not going to end up in a situation where your entire virtual platform goes down. If it does, we can always seize the roles. Right? Seizing the roles is a process that, you know, you would do if you lost those other domain controllers. And there's obviously some caveats there to how you would do that. But, you know, I don't think so. I mean, if you were using a smaller sized server or maybe a server that you were going to throw away anyway as your DC, you might not want that server running the extra load that the FSMA roles require. So
yeah, it's a lot easier to recover from a role seizure than a total absence of VMs or of DCs.
Right. So that's a long answer. I think the short answer is I don't think it matters.
Good point. Well, I actually say it comes down to which platform are you more comfortable protecting. You know, are you
right. Single server or the
yeah, or the HA cluster? And myself, I'd kind of go the HA cluster route.
Mm-hmm.
A couple other good questions here.
And I guess while you're looking for another question, people get kind of, if you haven't been through the somewhat awful situation where you have to do a role seizure, the whole concept of seizing those roles seems really scary. Once you've actually been through one and you've actually typed in the command, you know, seize FSMA role, you realize how trivial it really is. So I would not be too afraid of if that should ever have to happen to you. I've had to happen a couple of times in various consulting engagements where it's, oops, get out here really fast, we don't know what we just did. And it's really, in doing it, considering the scope of the failures that have occurred, it's kind of a trivial process, really. You type a couple commands and suddenly things start working again.
Good point. And Steve L. just threw out kind of a good additive to think about, and that is that think about which platform starts up faster in terms of your recovery to get the roles back. You know, if your physical starts up faster or if your virtual can get those roles running faster in any type of recovery situation, that might be a factor also.
Yeah, and you have to be conscious too. Remember, if you lose a domain controller, there is a timeout across all of your desktops and servers where they're going to attempt to contact the authenticating domain controller for a period of time before they realize, wait a minute, something's gone wrong. So speed, yes, is important, but lots and lots of speed as opposed to a little bit of speed is almost less important, because you have that little bit of timeout that occurs as the clients go, whoa, something's gone wrong. Exactly.
One question that's come up a couple of times, and I'm typing a response as we as I'm talking here, is okay. Well, the big question is, what's Veeam's answer? Okay, and why are we really providing this material? Basically, what we're attempting to do here is lay out these best practices that Greg's presented for us, really to allow people to take the next step in virtualizing their environment to fully leverage features like vPower. For example, vPower, if you're not familiar with Veeam backup and replication, allows virtual machine backups to be powered on directly from the backup file. We do that through a special service called vPower NFS, which I like to equate as a window into the backup files. And if you can look into the backup file, you have all your little or big VMs represented in a point of time. And what we're able to do is on the backup file is kind of map out just one virtual machine from a point in time and make it an inventoried and runnable virtual machine within the vSphere environment. That can be for things such as our instant VM recovery feature, a virtual lab, or a sure backup verification job. DCs come into play, not just to ensure that they are backed up correctly, but let's suppose we have a multi-tiered application that we want to use a virtual lab or a sure backup verification job, and those are isolated, meaning they can talk amongst themselves, like say the domain controller, an application server, a web server, and a database server to function in this little solution or big solution, whichever it may be. They may be contained in their own virtual lab environment, but they may need a domain controller to work correctly. So these tips are going to really enable domain controllers to really come into the fold, be backed up, ideally with Veeam backup and replication, and then really kind of round out the virtualization offering. And one of the things we do for this feature, and a couple of people have asked me about this, is Veeam backup and replication has a VSS requester integrated into the backup jobs as an option. So what that means is there's a perfect trifecta framework set forth by Windows, where Windows, and correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, because you are the expert on this, but Windows is the VSS provider. You know, the Windows Server provides this platform. A backup application such as Veeam is a VSS requester, and something like Active Directory, SQL Server, Exchange Server, those are VSS writers. Okay, so when a backup happens, as Veeam performs the backup, the framework via Windows VSS provider kind of gets all of these pieces on the same page, coordinates the fact that we're going to do a backup, and that phenomenon is called acquiescing. Am I saying that right, Greg?
Yes, quiescing or quiescence, either one.
Yes. Yeah, it's a hard word, but basically it's a framework that ensures application consistent backups. Veeam backup and replication provides that framework in the jobs, including jobs that you would back up a domain controller, and that allows a consistent backup. And that's the difference between I don't want to say a dumb snapshot or a simple snapshot that doesn't do anything to the application state, because a simple snapshot is crash consistent, not application consistent. So you need that VSS is the primary technology. You need that quiescence to ensure that that point in time is correct. Simply speaking, I would point everyone to check out the white paper and webinar that Greg has done on volume shadow services for Windows. Again, general thought leadership topics to really kind of round out your virtualization approach. Those are both available for replay and download on the Veeam website. A couple more questions have come in, and I apologize if I'm not getting over to all of them. Peter asks, generally speaking, how much disk space do snapshots consume? That depends, but they will never exceed the size of all VMDKs together. That's the only guaranteed answer I can give you. One person had asked, from a design perspective, and let me see if I can find it. I can't pronounce the first name, sorry about that, but Mr. Tai asks, are there any security best practices when virtualizing domain controllers, specifically around the VMDK files? Any security recommendations, best practices you could throw out there, Greg?
Yes, there are actually. So VMware's Security Hardening Guide, which is a document you can download from VMware. Excellent, excellent, excellent guide, and it actually is the foundation for even the U.S. government's auditing control program for ESX. So I think it's called the vSphere Security Hardening Guide. So that guide explains that it is not recommended for you to make any changes to the permissions inside of the VMFS partition. So don't go chmodding anything in VMFS. What is a better idea is to, inside of the vSphere layer, right? So when you go virtualize, you're actually adding another layer of security management to your IT environment. And that layer is the vSphere layer, right? Can I access the VM? Can I power it on? Can I power it off? Can I snapshot it? All those different actions that you would do to the VM itself, and maybe not necessarily its contents. So it is a good practice for you to go and limit, console access, the ability to power on, power off, and all of those very painful and important types of actions that one person would be able to do at the vSphere layer. Excellent question, in fact.
Another question that came up, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention it, is that Veeam Backup and Replication has a series of wizards. I mentioned vPower to do instant VM recovery, virtual labs, and backup job verification, but our universal application item recovery, aka UAIR wizards, can allow single item extraction out of the backup. So a good example is a deleted account. As long as it still has a tombstone value, we can retrieve that object out of Active Directory. I'm looking for another question here. A couple of them are kind of the same question made over, but Travis asks a good question of, let's say we need to restore a domain controller. And I'm going to take Travis's question just as it's written and assume an entire domain controller. Any special considerations we need to consider? Should we just restore from the backup and then ensure that replication catches a server up? I've got an answer myself, but what's your answer, Greg, on that?
So I don't work for Veeam. So my answer is that in many cases, it's just easier just to create a new domain controller and allow Active Directory to replicate to that new DC in the case that you've lost that domain controller. So, from the non-Veeam perspective, outside of their software solution set, the use case where the domain controller has died and you need to create a new one can often be solved by just simply creating another Windows instance and adding the Active Directory role. Now, that's one potential use case. There are other potential use cases where Microsoft does not provide, from a platform perspective, Microsoft does not provide really good tools to recover from. Obviously, I have Active Directory corruption, right? I end up with some sort of data that gets spun around my domain controllers and causes corruption to the database. Cascading replication failure is another big problem. Loss of entire forest is another big problem, usually due to replication of bad data. So all of these are other use cases that are not well solved inside of the platform itself. Now, I think Rick will probably have a similar but slightly different answer to this.
And my answer is have multiple domain controllers, spread more left, right than up, down in terms of domains of failure, and I personally deal with the role seizure recovery rather than a whole DC recovery. It's an application. Active Directory Domain Services is an application that has built-in redundancy at the application level. Of course, you have to deal with role seizures, but I would actually spread it out. Still back them up, hope you'd never have to restore them all, that type of thing. We do need to move over to another question. The last question here that I'm going to be able to answer is from David D. What are your thoughts on VMware Site Recovery Manager or EMC Site Recovery, which replicates machine at the block level? Should I put that in my DR plan, aka solution? What am I supposed to watch out for? David, my answer is, because Active Directory domain services are kind of built-in distributed application, is in that remote site. Just have Active Directory services running in a production capacity in the remote site, not replicate it, let the application keep it up to date. Greg, your thought?
Yeah, exactly the same thing. So SRM works wonderfully well when you have applications that do not have their own built-in, really easy to use replication system. If you have IP connectivity between primary and backup site, which most of us do, it's just easier, I think, just to put another AD domain controller in there and let them replicate. The replication traffic is relatively light usually.
Yep. Final cheap plug is that the Veeam podcast I recorded last night with Sean Clark talks about that very topic. So I encourage you guys to check out the Veeam podcast, as well as these other resources here. Twitter, we have a Twitter account at Veeam. We're on Facebook. We have the blog, which I mentioned earlier. Now it is time for me to ask the question based on Greg's material. So if you're interested in winning these books, go ahead and get the virtual Q&A panel online. And I apologize for those of you I didn't get to every question. I do encourage you, if you have specific product issues, we do regular demos of the products, and you can find those on the Veeam website at veeam.com/product-demo.html. For the prizes here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you a question based on Greg's material. The answer is going to have 2 words, so this one's tough compared to the previous ones. I need 2 words. And just get the question ready and send the answer over. The first 10 correct responses, or close enough correct responses, depending on how I feel, will win their choice of these books right here. The question comes from Greg's point number 12. Regarding Active Directory domain controllers, we should have not a plan, but a solution for blank blank. 2 words are my answer. Yeah, there we go.
You said this is going to be a hard one.
Well, I forgot to take the question, actually, so I had to come up with one towards the end. So I have plenty of answers. Wow, that was quick. Disaster recovery was the right answer. So basically, regarding Active Directory controllers, we want to have not a plan, but a solution for disaster recovery. And Greg, this has been a great webinar. I really appreciate your time.
I'm glad to come and talk with you again, Rick.
Outstanding. Well, everyone, that concludes today's featured webinar. Again, you will get an email with the PowerPoint slides and the ability to replay the demo. That should come in a couple of days, and I encourage you guys to check out more Veeam featured webinars as well as white papers. Thanks again, Greg. Cheers.